Hi, Jordan.
Hi, Cindy.
I am super excited to talk with you today, and Kathy is as well. We really are looking forward to hearing your perspective and your experiences. And so maybe we can start off and you can share a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the field of counseling.
Yeah, sure. I'm a recent graduate. I have my master's and the I'm a licensed associate professional counselor, so that's very nice. Um, Currently, I am working outpatient um, as an outpatient therapist, and kind of getting into the counseling field was a kind of a long journey. Um, I really started with that, I think a common expression of like I was the friend that a lot of my friends came to talk with issues. Also kind of being like a family mediator, that kind of thing. I think really drew me to uh, develop unique skills that just kind of predisposed me to the counseling profession. And so as I kind of went through middle school, high school, eventually college, I realized that counseling was a field that engaged me in such a way that I felt that it was something I could do and love. And I felt that that was something that was crucial in whatever I was going to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think you mentioned being able to identify certain characteristics from an early age, being that friend, being that family member. I think that takes a lot of insight. I think sometimes people brush that aside and think that's just a part of being a friend. But usually there is one or two people in a group that has those kind of tangible or intangible qualities. You know, the warmth, the good listening. All of those qualities that are really challenging, but having those as your foundation to kind of propel you into the field, I think is really great, and it takes a lot of insight. And I also really like that kind of at the helm of everything was your desire to love what you were doing and to be really passionate. And I think especially in this field that's really important. It's hard to fake that.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I'm super excited to talk about today is your interest in psychoanalysis. And for all the viewers of this video, Jordan was a student of mine, and I always found it remarkable, his love, his penchant for psychoanalysis. Um, his understanding, his grasp of concepts, his execution of concepts. So let's start there. And can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to that particular framework?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In our program, I know one thing that you often um, and other professors also just kind of really ingrained in us was the importance of having a theoretical orientation, at least having some sort of foundation that we could base our understanding of how people work in. And so, as I was trying to develop that, I felt kind of stunted in that regard. Um, because I saw all my peers, they kind of found theirs almost instantaneously compared to mine. At least that was my perspective of all of it. And so I was kind of feeling left out here, and I grabbed onto something with Gestalt therapy, which was really looking at looking Gestalt like the whole person, kind of seeing the person as almost like certain fragments in some way, and really focusing on integrating the individual. And I really liked that idea, and I thought it paired well with my more naturally confrontational approach. And as I went through the program, I noticed some aspects of birth order from Alfred Adler kind of popping up in my own life. And so once I saw like, oh, like, I have two brothers and I was the youngest, and I was kind of seeing some interesting dynamics reflecting on my life. And as I was reflecting on my life, I thought like this was really intellectually engaging, really stimulating for me. and so I decided to give psychodynamic theory a try. And I started with Adler and thinking a bit more about those family systems. And then I stumbled more into Freud's lens. I read The Interpretation of Dreams by Freud, and at that point, I was like, I was in. I was hooked. Uh, and from that point on, I feel like I've just been trying to learn all I can about the theory, continually practice it with my clients and refine it and hone those foundational skills and some more of those technical skills related to psychoanalytic therapy.
Oh, that's amazing. I think it's really interesting to hear people's kind of theoretical journey, and it's interesting kind of the pieces of Gestalt and Adlerian theory that you were drawn to, and how they actually overlay with psychoanalysis. So, you mentioned kind of that looking at the whole person in Gestalt, and that certainly when I think of psychodynamic, I think of it as being a super comprehensive. It's not like something you can speed through. It's very holistic, very comprehensive. And certainly with Adler and family, or birth order rather, and family composition, family dynamics are really front and center with psychoanalysis as well. So I liked hearing kind of that journey. But another thing that really stands out to me is that you really took your time to invest in what theory resonated with you. And kind of circling back to something that I've mentioned to you before is I think that psychoanalysis is very deep, and I think it attracts very deep thinkers. And so to me, that's evidenced just in your exploration of kind of where you landed. And I would be remiss if I did not mention my appreciation for your confrontation. I've said this to you on numerous occasions. And, Kathy and viewers, Jordan is exceptional with confrontation. It's something that I've noticed a lot of counselors sometimes shy away from. And sometimes people even think it's antithetical to counseling when in fact it's really integral to counseling.
No, I totally agree. I think that confrontation kind of gets a bad rep sometimes. I think when thinking of confrontation, we kind of think of maybe like some sort of disagreement or almost like an argument. At least that's kind of what comes to my mind at first. And really, what confrontation looks like in therapy is just is bringing attention to something that maybe the client is not aware of at that point. Um, and oftentimes doing that in a more direct fashion, kind of expediting the process a little bit.
100%. I think even you mentioned, I have those same connotations with conflict, or confrontation rather. And I think about things like an argument. And as an extension, I think of somebody who's argumentative. And I think maybe even for counselors, they want to shed any connotation to being an argumentative person. Because, most counselors, I would think, lean in with identifying as an empathic person. And those qualities don't have to, they can sit next to each other, confrontation and empathy, as you pointed out.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Kathy, what are your thoughts? Kathy is really good at confrontation also.
Ooh.
I do. I think that that right now is an area where clinicians tend to hesitate. And I don't speak for all clinicians. I just think that that's an area where sometimes we feel that discomfort. And if we can sit with that and use that, it can be such a powerful tool for people. I used to work with someone that would say, conflict breeds intimacy. And I have to say that's really very true. And when we can sit with discomfort, conflict, and use it in a therapeutic way to confront those feelings, we're really able to make progress, and in often a very unexpected way. Sometimes those are things people weren't thinking that that's what they were bringing to the session or coming to talk about, but then it takes that root And that can be very powerful for people. So, and I loved hearing about your journey to theory. I like to study the theory of Murray Bowen, family systems theory, and he talked about theory being the windshield wipers that guide us, in the snowstorm. So when we kind of get in that snowstorm, we have those wipers to clear the path, and that is the theory that guides us, and so helpful. So I'm happy to hear that you found your theory that aligns with your clinical thinking.
Oh
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that psychodynamic, psychoanalytic theory, a little interchangeable there, but the theory itself just it has a complexity to it, um, that I think is uh it's obtained like in those Psych 101 classes, like people can see like, whoa, like this is deep, this is complex, there seems like a lot kind of going on here. And I think that that just resonates with me because uh, fundamentally, that's how I see the human mind. I see that's how I see people as just very complex individuals, everyone being, exceptionally unique, with exceptionally unique inner conflicts. And that's really what psychoanalytic theory hones in on, th those inner conflicts and the uniqueness of each individual.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm really drawn to the words that both of you are highlighting in terms of complexity and intimacy, and confrontation, and how those all kind of merge together. It's interesting because I think sometimes people, um, at least on the surface, think that therapy should be safe and nice and harmonious at all times, and not to say that you can have a safe environment and also take risks and be vulnerable, but I think that psychoanalysis really launches into that stratosphere. And so I'm curious, Jordan, before we talk more about some of the techniques and do some hands-on role plays, I do think, and you and I have chatted before about how psychoanalysis sometimes gets a bad rap in today's day. And in fact, I see, and Kathy, I don't know if you see in your program too, that a lot of students really don't identify with that theory as much. I mean, every once in a while I'll see it, but it's very rare. And so that's why whenever I have a student who does connect with psychoanalysis, it's so intriguing, and I really kind of cherish that what feels like a deviation from today's norm. So, can you talk a little bit about why? First of all, do you agree with that, and what do you think is the reason behind that?
Yeah, Cindy, I totally agree with that. A I heard somebody say to understand psychoanalysis is to resist it. And I think that, that's true in some part, to an extent, because so many of the ideas and the notions that were set forth as foundational, as fundamental to the theory are very aversive for some people. Um, and getting into really why that is, I see that as a cultural thing. Um, you're mentioning that you don't see many students that are drawn to that theory, and so looking at from a cultural perspective, right here in the United States, we have a managed care system, right? That's one side of the coin here, where it's really incentivized to have kind of the shortest term treatment with the most effective um, result, kind of balancing those things. Um, on top of that, Americans have or tend to have, I should say, a more culturally ingrained notion of free will, of that freedom component within them. And so something like cognitive behavioral therapy, which you see a lot in the United States, it almost to me offers this notion that we can be masters of our minds in some way, that there are these irrational thoughts and beliefs, and we can find them and we can tweak them, and then we can in some way become that master of our minds. Whereas psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory says we're not really masters of our minds. There is a part of our minds that it's not accessible to us, but it is still influencing how we think and how we feel and how we behave, our decisions. So I feel like that's probably a really big point right there is that cultural aspect in the United States just overall being resistant to the idea of not having control sometimes of our thoughts, actions, all of that.
Wow, I never really thought about the latter. I agree wholeheartedly with the former in terms of, you know, our society likes, things done now, and we like, it's reflected in managed care, but I think it's also a cultural norm of wanting things to happen with the snap of a finger and not kind of willing to endure the process as much. But I think that's really interesting, that concept of control. And, you mentioned that people and some theoretical frameworks like the idea of kind of mastering your mind. And so I wonder, as I'm listening to, tell me if this connects with you, or maybe you have a better way to describe it. When I'm thinking of psychoanalysis, I'm thinking that maybe an individual, instead of mastering their thoughts, they're partnering with their thoughts or deferring to their thoughts. What would you think? How would you kind of capture that?
No, I think that partnering works well. Looking at that integration, which again kind of harks back to my original interest in Gestalt, right? That integration of the unconscious aspects, uh, once unconscious becoming conscious. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think that's food for thought. And maybe in hearing you mention some of these components, it'll give people pause to reconsider maybe brushing aside psychoanalysis.
Yeah, absolutely. One other quick point on this that I'm thinking of is when we think of treatments, I think that, or really anything, I think that we're often looking at it from our own cultural perspective, right? And so psychoanalysis is something, it's a treatment modality that is actually living quite well in other locations. I know that Argentina is a place that is very much lively in their psychoanalysis movement. It's more so a common thing to be in your own analysis, and that would be like analysis proper. Those 3 to 5 times a week it is sort of culturally normed, and I think that it just kind of shows some more evidence towards that cultural aspect, and I find it really really interesting.
I find it interesting too. And um, I didn't know that about Argentina. And I wasn't even thinking about this framework from kind of a worldwide or international perspective. But I think that really speaks volumes about, some of those cultural norms trickling down and impacting um, therapy that an individual might want to pursue, as well as how we frame things like best practices, and just being mindful of those cultural norms, I think, is important. Yeah, Kathy, you work with students at the bachelor's level in social work. Do you engage with students who you seem to have a do you have a understanding of their perspective on psychoanalysis?
I think typically, particularly in the undergraduate level, that's a real leap for students. Not for all, but for most students. To your point, I think it's hard. It's hard to understand, it's hard to study. Anybody that's ever read Freud knows you have to really dig in and sit with it and really expand your thinking to understand, or to try to understand. And so it's hard work, and you have to get to a level where you can process that. So I wouldn't say that it's not that students can't, but it's next level thinking. So I've even seen that with graduate students as well as professionals in the field. It's not everyone that's able to sort of make that commitment to learning and mastering and understanding.
That's so interesting. I think those are excellent points. And it does take commitment, it takes mastery, it takes time to develop and cultivate those skills. And that might be scary to students. I wonder if the opposite could be true as well. I feel like psychoanalysis and Freud is a kind of renowned psychologist that most people have heard of since they were in high school. And I think sometimes people learn kind of uh, just hear about, the basic, not basic concepts, but they memorize some terms like their basic concepts. Like they are like, oh, I know about Freud. I know the id, ego, and superego. And they kind of look at it, or there's a potential for a person to look at those as kind of basic because they've heard them for so long, and they've known about Freud for so long, when in fact all of those concepts are not basic. They are super drenched and steeped in meaning, and they're like peeling back to the unconscious. I mean, is just such a labor intensive process. But I think sometimes there can be an impression of just memorizing concepts and feeling like you fully grasp what the theory entails.
Which oversimplifies the theory.
Yeah, yeah. Which I think is ironic. It oversimplifies a very complex theory.
No, I think that's absolutely right. You see it all the time. Uh, I think that Freud has just been culturally ingrained, just in our clinical zeitgeist, and we see aspects of it, not only clinically but just socially as well. People always talking about, well, you're in denial, right? Like happening to use some of Freud's ideas kind of in this more natural way. It's almost like an ex you can't get over, like we're trying not to think about him, but now we're using all of his stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good tangible example of that. You're in denial, you're anal retentive. We just kind of use these terms casually. Um, I think also with Freud, since, everybody has heard of Freud, and we consider Freud the father of psychology and so forth. Um, and so there's this familiarity with Freud, and so because of that, I feel like people are taught early on the critiques of Freud,
Mm.
and whereas all frameworks obviously have proponents and critiques, strengths and weaknesses, but I feel like people really lean into the criticism and not the strength. At least that's what I seem to engage with, and so I think that's an interesting phenomenon as well.
Yeah, and I think that that does, um, perhaps reflect some of that cultural bias as well of just not wanting to, is that Kathy, like you were explaining, like there's the difficulty in engaging with the material, but also the potential for engaging with the material can be self-revealing in a way that is difficult for some people to kind of hold for themselves.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, giving lots of points of reflection, Jordan, as always. And I really love thinking about some of these pieces of Freud and psychoanalysis. Um, and Kathy, too, I really appreciate just kind of all of these perspectives that we're kind of mulling over and chewing on together.
And another perspective I would offer is from a disciplinary lens. When I have had the opportunity to really see psychodynamic theory or psychoanalytic theory at work, it has been with psychiatrists. And so I
Mm,
don't know if it's they have advanced training in that theory. They have more time in their educational trajectory to dive in and study. They tend to be strong students anyway because they're in medical school and then become
mhm.
physicians. Like, I'm not sure what that is about, but I definitely notice that from a disciplinary lens, I've seen had the experience or opportunity to really see psychoanalysis or psychodynamic theory at work with psychiatry. And so I don't know if that's a function of graduate medical education or their training lens, but they seem to be able to grasp it in a different way. So something for us to think about coming from psychology, counseling, social work.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That is a really intriguing perspective. And why is it that maybe does psychoanalysis lend itself more to a medical model? And if so, why? Or like you said, Kathy, could it be that medical students themselves possess certain qualities that lend itself to psychoanalysis? I think those are all really good questions.
Yeah, Kathy, that's a brilliant point. And one reason that I think some of that might still be prevalent, that idea of seeing medical degrees as psychoanalysts is I believe that the psychoanalytic institutes that were affiliated with the International Psychoanalytic Association, the American Psychoanalytic Association. Um, I believe it was around maybe the 80s. It was certainly the late 1900s when they made a switch. So originally it was that only medical degree holders were able to pursue full psychoanalytic training to become
Mm.
psychoanalysts, which was very, very contra to what Freud was really advocating for. But again, kind of an Americanization of psychoanalysis there. And then just in those past probably 40 or so years now, they've made that switch to individuals who are um, psychologists with a doctorate degree or clinical therapists with a master's degree are also able to pursue full psychoanalytic training to become psychoanalysts.
So that's exciting. That means we may see some change over the next 30 or 40 years.
Absolutely, I hope so.
Yeah, I think that is really exciting. And I'm impressed with both of your knowledge bases in terms of not just the kind of therapeutic components of psychoanalysis, but just understanding kind of the lineage and some of those kind of periphery pieces in terms of disciplines and so forth. So I think this is really, really interesting. So I wonder, Jordan, if we want to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about techniques. And maybe you can walk us through some techniques. We can certainly, hear your perspective on techniques as well as do some hands on exercises. And I am more than happy to be your guinea pig in terms of, some of those application pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally open to talk a little bit about techniques or anything like that.
Wonderful. Which technique would you like to talk about first?
Well, I'd say a really big one that I think is really commonly associated with psychoanalysis is the idea of dream interpretation. And like individuals coming in, talking about their dreams on the couch, right? And then that interpretation, you get that picture in your mind of the cigar and all of that. Um, we could talk a little bit about that a little bit.
I would love to. I am a big dream lover. I've always been interested in dream interpretation, dream analysis, and just by happenstance, I happen to have a dream that I'm willing to share. And I actually accidentally xed out of my email, and it's taking me a second to get back in. I was going to read it for you, but since my emails being a little cranky. Jordan, would you be willing to read the dream that I sent you and Kathy earlier today?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Um, so we have this dream, right, from this morning from Cindy. I was at Target looking at towels, which were hanging on clothing racks as opposed to being folded on shelves. The clothing racks were positioned higher than normal, and I remember looking upward as I was sifting through the towels, which were plush and billowing downward. The towels were a dark green color, and when I looked up at them, there was a brightness above me, as though rays of sunlight were streaming down, although I was definitely in a contained store. At that moment, I recalled a conversation with someone This wasn't a conversation from real life, nor was it a person I actually know, but in the dream, he was an acquaintance from work. What I remembered him saying was, every time I'm at Target, I buy my mom a pair of pajamas. And I said, every time? I was surprised because I wondered how many sets of pajamas any one person needed. He said, of course. And there was a tinge of judgment in his tone. His response made me feel guilty, ashamed, and misunderstood because I realized he thought that I was questioning why he would do something so nice for his mom, which wasn't my intention at all. As mentioned, I just thought that this would be an excessive number of pajamas. His comment triggered an impromptu decision to buy pajamas for my mom. I turned around, instead of walking to another aisle, and found racks of pajamas. They were all the same style, baggy, button-down, long-sleeved fleece shirts and pants, all in baby blue. I remember wishing that they were green, which is my mom's favorite color. And all of a sudden, I was sifting through a batch of pajamas that were, in fact, green, and in various sizes. I pulled out a pair that looked to be her size. Just then, my dad appeared, in a way that seemed organic, like he was also at Target and had just turned the corner into the aisle where I was. And he also seemed invested in purchasing the pajamas for my mom. He said, I think those are too big, and she'll need a smaller size. I didn't agree, but went with his suggestion anyway. There you
Thank
have it.
you so much, Jordan. Oh, I love the way how animated you are when you read. You have a really good narration. That was awesome. And I apologize again that I accidentally exited out of my inbox. But yeah, that was my dream. Thank you for reading it. What I think is so interesting about dream interpretation is there's almost a tendency, like if I were to relay to somebody in the morning, like, oh yeah, I had a dream about I was looking for towels in Target, and then I, wanted to buy my mom some pajamas. Like, it almost seems very silly, right? It seems irrelevant. It seems silly. And so what's amazing to me is that when you kind of peel back the layers and you analyze it, so much stuff comes up. So I'm curious to hear kind of your impression about, or to engage with you in dialogue about kind of what some of that peeling back of the process would entail.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into this.
Yes.
You know, you make it a good point about that nonsensical way sometimes dreams can appear and how irrelevant they can seem, how trivial they can seem. And so what psychoanalysis does is it kind of flips this notion on its head and says, well, it's trivial, its impression is trivial, in perhaps a way that, or in a part that's supposed to be actually quite significant. Perhaps the meaning that is significant within the dream holds a lot of emotional baggage, and is better left unknown to the conscious mind. And so through a bunch of distorting and all of that, you get this weird dream that you can't really make a whole lot of sense of, but hey, you can't know about that really difficult meaning, that really difficult desire or wish, whatever it might be, um, that you were maybe unconsciously kind of presenting there in that dream.
That's a really great way to frame it. That what I think about when you're describing it in that way is almost like the dream offers a wealth of insight and information, but it's potentially a lot for a person to handle and to acknowledge and identify. So it's almost like a mask. Like, imagine a playful mask that's silly or comical, and you have the choice to take the mask off and see the truth, or you can keep it on and just kind of brush it aside as something that's inane.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It has like this I almost think of it as like a protective process, for some dreams, just to kind of make sure you're okay, like we don't need to be thinking about this. It's not going to feel good to think
Yeah.
about this. So, yeah.
Oh, I love it.
Hmm.
I love
Okay.
it. And I'm ready to dive in.
Yes, yes. Um, so I took some notes, by the way.
Oh, good.
Um, so In thinking about dreams, the first thing that comes to my mind is, uh-oh, where do we go? We have this considerably long dream. It's not a quick fragment. There's some decent depth to all of this. Um, all the descriptions and everything. So as the clinician, I think it is common to have that thought of like, where do I start with all of
Mhm.
this? Do we start at the beginning? Do we start at the end? In the middle? Is it this part? Is it the colors? Is it the
Mhm.
person? There's a lot to take
Mhm.
in. And so from what I've read, what I've learned and experienced, one spot that we certainly start with is the emotions and what carries some emotional weight with the dreamer, because that'll have uh, likely some significance, perhaps some deeper meaning there. Um, so, for example, right, if we're looking at your dream, Cindy, um, you had this conversation with this acquaintance from work that you don't really know, but in the dream you knew. And he said, every time I'm at Target, I buy my mom a pair of pajamas. You say, every time? And he says, of course. And you felt kind of like that judgmental tone. And you mentioned feelings of, being guilty, ashamed, and misunderstood, right?
Mhm.
So, if we were analyzing this dream, I might ask you, uh, thinking about the maybe past past day, past 3 days, something like that. Um, can you recall any moments where you might have been feeling guilty or ashamed or misunderstood?
Mhm. Yeah. I absolutely can. Did you want me to share those with you?
We don't necessarily need to.
Mm.
Obviously this is I think dreams can get a bit deep pretty fast.
Yeah.
But that's sort of the dialogue that we could start stimulating, right?
Mhm.
Focusing in on those emotions. There are, however, instances where maybe there's not an emotion that the dreamer recognizes. It's like there's just this kind of nonsense dream, right? Um,
Mhm.
you have that weird dream where there's like some giant eyeball alien kind of lasering you, right? It's like I didn't really feel a whole lot during it, but it was weird. So one thing that you can ask is like asking like, okay, so looking at this dream, Cindy, and this is one that you can answer here. Looking at this dream, was there anything that stood out to you as potentially significant or potentially holding a deeper meaning?
Yeah, I think that you really hit it spot on that I think the crux, the most emotional pang I felt was the feeling of being misunderstood. Like, no, that's not what I meant. And wanting to explain myself and feeling impacted by his comment. That was foremost the emotion that I came out with. But also, I remember, and it sounds silly, but when I was looking upward at the towels and they were like billowing, it almost felt ethereal.
Mm.
Like there was this light coming down, and it felt very um, joyful. Which sound again on the surface sounds silly, like joyful looking at towels at Target. But I remember
Right.
just the fabric was so lush and it just it felt really like there was like a tactile experience, there was an ethereal experience.
Mm.
So it was almost like that experience and then feeling a little crushed that my my intentions were misunderstood.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Okay, I have that jotted down to come back to in a second. Um, I do want to mention, kind of continuing on with this kind of aspect of where to begin. Um, Another aspect you could start with is like the quotations, right? The dialogue within the dream. Um, Freud had the idea that all of the dialogue in dreams it was taken from uh, real life in some way. You heard that directly or indirectly. You like maybe watched it on TV, you read about it, but that dialogue somehow popped up, which is why sometimes maybe the dialogue doesn't always fit within a conversation sometimes. Um, and then one other part that we could talk about that now kind of we can take all of this that we've been talking about and relate it to is the idea of day residue. And this is we sort of touched on it for a second there, but the idea that our dreams, we hear from neurocognitive science that there's a lot of memory consolidation going on. And Freud in his time in the 1800s, or I suppose he published this in 1900, but was that dreams are taken from the past probably 72 hours or so, of memories as your brain's kind of going through all these memories. And so those images in some way may have been taken from recent experiences. Same thing with the quotes. And so let's kind of play this out for a second. Um, you were mentioning in terms of like the significance moment, the plush towels, right? The streaking down of sunlight. Um, Thinking back over the past couple days, can you recall any instances where you were either perhaps feeling or connected in some way with something really soft, or perhaps even feeling rays of sunlight, as you were saying, coming down on you, anything like that?
Yeah, actually, yesterday was my husband's birthday, and we went to eat at a restaurant, and it was outdoors on a patio. And it's funny because it was gorgeous and it was serene and it was beautiful, but where we were sitting, the sun was coming right at me. And so we were sitting at a long table, just the two of us, and there was a pole, and I kept having to like move my seat because I loved the sunshine, but I didn't want it to glare in my eyes. So I was constantly like shifting in my seat to so that it wasn't like penetrating my eyes. So I wonder if it might have come from there.
Yeah, it may have. It may have. And what we might do, kind of continuing forward with that, is looking deeper at that moment.
Mm,
And we might associate, try a little bit of that free association um, with that moment, with the perhaps the notion of being pursued by this light, this warmth. Um, I find it interesting in here you made it seem like you were like really like kind of basking in some of that sunlight, like kind of
mhm.
enjoying it. And when you were at the picnic table, it seemed like as much as you wanted to kind of enjoy that, like you kind of had to keep shifting away um, from it. And so one way that we would maybe explore this, and again, this is a very quick point. We wouldn't be necessarily, I wouldn't be this direct, I suppose, with clients, but one way we might explore this is like, okay, well, there was this feeling of wanting to be in the sunlight, but not wanting to have all of the effects of the sun on you.
Mhm.
Um, and so, a Freudian interpretation would be more about wish fulfillment, the idea that our dreams are somehow fulfilling some wish of ours, some desire of ours that we had. Um, and so here, it sounded like you wanted to be in the sunlight, right? So maybe you just had a moment where you were able to kind of bask in some of that sunlight and enjoy some of that, you know. That's kind of what comes to my mind with that. Does that resonate at all with you?
It does. It resonates really deeply. And honestly, when I looked at my dream and I was considering it and anticipating this conversation, that never occurred to me. I was going to let you and Kathy know beforehand that the pajamas, the baby blue pajamas, the last time I was at my parents' house, I saw a pair on the dresser at my parents' house. And I was like, oh, I wonder if that somehow like had some staying power.
Hmm.
And so I was going to mention that familiarity with that type of pajama, but the connection with the sunlight and your interpretation never crossed my mind. I think, and as you talk about it, it does have a lot of relevance, and I can kind of connect with what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that is so principal in dream interpretation, is to, as the clinician, to be so aware of yourself, um, in not imposing an
Mm.
interpretation on the client, but allowing a client to come with their own interpretation. Um, all that I do as a clinician when I am helping a client interpret their dream is I present some hypotheses. That's what it'll look like, and that's how I think about them. They're nothing more than that. They can, fall, at the drop of a hair, and that's fine. Uh, but I think that's something that some people maybe misunderstand about psychoanalysis. They might think like, uh, I would come in with my dream, I would tell it, and then he'd tell me what it means, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But really, it's work. It's work on the client's part, and really the clinician's there to help guide you through.
I absolutely get the sense from that in just how you've demonstrated it. I like that how you kind of, um, you know, you pulled something from underneath the table, propped it up, and said, like, here's a possibility. Like, let's connect. What do you think about this? What is an experience that you could maybe connect with this aspect? And so I felt like your demonstration was super collaborative and really helped kind of have that two-way dialogue, as opposed to, I agree with you. There's almost this idea of, oh, this, if you have a dream about sun, it means hope. If you have a dream about, you know, towels, it means, you feel dirty, or, whatever the case is,
Mhm.
that there's prescribed meaning to it. And that your demonstration did not allude to that at all.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's actually misunderstood with Freud as well, because, in reading his book on dreams, he's very clear about uh, having the client be the one who creates their meaning, with the dream. Like the idea that, this is not necessarily going to mean the same thing to this person as this other person. And so I think we as clinicians, need to be aware of that possibility, um, as we are providing hypotheses about things.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, but I also like that there was still some input from you. And I like that you kind of propped something up in front of me that maybe I wouldn't have seen. Like when I walked away from the dream and was thinking about it throughout the day, I was thinking about the feeling of guilt and misunderstanding. I was thinking maybe, engagement with my parents and, implications there. But I wasn't necessarily thinking about, aside from the joyful feeling of having the sunrise down, I wasn't connecting it to like a recent experience of mine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have no doubts that there's something there with your parents, and you're seeing that yourself, that there's perhaps some personal significance with that. Um, I know we're nearing the end of our time here, but I just want to mention that something else that we're kind of looking for in a dream interpretation is not just, kind of that where to begin, but when we're in that deep phase of, having those free associations, really looking at those, daytime residues, what recently occurred, and all those weird images in the dream. Um, One thing that we can do is we can look at how the mind distorts the dream. Um, One thing that Freud had done was kind of label different ways that the mind kind of distorts those unconscious wishes, as he would put it, to be more acceptable to the conscious mind. And we're not going to go through all of those today, but one thing I wanted to mention was, one of those was you could take the dream as you told it, um, and flip it, in terms of time, right? So let's say instead of starting from beginning to end, starting from end to beginning, sometimes, we can time doesn't really make sense in dreams. And so when we wake up, our mind's like, we need to make some sort of narrative to this. And one way it can do that is, taking the dream, flipping it over. This makes sense. let's do it like this. And so the reason that I bring that up is because I thought it was interesting how you have this guy that you're talking to who seemingly comes out of nowhere. Um, in your mind, right? You kind of had this conversation. Um, and after that, your dad also kind of peers over from the other aisle, right? And so if we kind of flip that on its head and we start with that conversation with your dad, that you just had about your mother and buying stuff for your mother. Um, you have this anonymous guy who's saying every time I'm at Target, I buy my mom a pair of pajamas, maybe my mom being like my wife, but because you're the dreamer, kind of still seeing that as my mom. Um, it's an interesting way, I think, to look at dreams if you're hitting a bit of a stuck point um, in the interpretation, just flipping it on its head and seeing what that narrative might play out like if it's backwards.
I love that. First of all, I love that even as we were entering into the dream analysis, you said that the clinician doesn't have to, the process doesn't have to be linear in terms of we're starting at the beginning of the dream sequence and moving forward. I love that it's not, it doesn't have to be sequential in that manner. But I also think that in turning the timeline on its head, it does like the sequence of emotions, like that joyful feeling, that's the landing point now, as opposed to the starting point. And that I think is offers, rich insights into what might be at play.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's almost like when I'm reflecting on what you're saying about, the unconscious has so much to tell us. Do we want to listen to it or do we not want to? And it can manifest in a playful, comical way, as dreams often do, or like a shocking way. But almost it's like, okay, we have to throw in this timeline because the humans understand life in accordance to a timeline. But that's almost like a manufactured uh, extra ingredient that does that. We take the timeline away, and then now we're presented with even more possibilities.
Yeah, for sure. I think Freud would maybe further that point to say that the unconscious mind lives free of time. And so there is that emphasis in psychoanalysis on early relational experience, but that is important in so much as that the unconscious is also living in that simultaneously. Because that time isn't really as much of an issue. So we see in dreams we have those fleeting thoughts that in some way get stitched together, to make some sort of conscious sense in it.
That's fascinating. I think this has really presented dream interpretation for someone who's always loved it. You've even added more layers for me to mull over and to really kind of contemplate. I think this is super fascinating. Kathy, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Jordan. This was really a treat to think about how it works, which I'm not familiar with. So I really
Mm.
enjoyed this learning opportunity. And when I heard the dream, I immediately went straight to, well, it's about guilt, about not seeing mom, buying more pajamas, like all my interpretation. So I love when you said, you know what, the therapist, that's not what this is.
Mm.
Um, and that was my natural inclination. So it just shows this isn't for somebody that's not trained in it.
Yeah, that's a really good comment, Kathy. And I do think also that when a lot of counselors think of a collaborative counseling framework, they don't often they think of maybe a humanistic theory, person centered, existential, where it's, overtly very collaborative. I feel like people don't often think about psychoanalysis for some reason. I think they think of it as being more maybe paternalistic and being more influenced by the analyst. But your presentation, Jordan, was super collaborative. And I felt like I really had a lot of agency as I was also collaborating with you and your expertise.
I'm glad that you felt that because yeah, that is my intention with you and with clients to have this more relational approach. And I agree. I wholeheartedly believe that psychoanalysis is a a relational humanistic approach in some way, because one of the large tenets of the theory is transference. And I know there's a school of thought, relational psychoanalysis, which is really, it's just that transference. That's the main thing. Looking at this relationship between me, the clinician, and you, the client, and how are we feeling about each other, really looking at that immediacy in the session, so that they can take the skills that they're using interpersonally with me, the clinician, and then use those in their interpersonal life.
Absolutely. I think that looking at, again, we sometimes memorize transference and countertransference, but really understanding how dimensional it is and how applicable it is and how really um, just how dynamic that relationship is and how it really plays such an important part in the clinical relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my goodness, I know we're up against the hour, and I feel like I know I could talk about this for 10 more hours and still feel like I'm just scratching the surface. Um, so I just want to really appreciate your time, your knowledge, your passion, your skill. All of that was highly on display here, Jordan, and just super impressed. And just on a personal note, I hope it was meaningful for all of our viewers. I know personally for me, I have a lot that I am going to think about and unpack and put under the microscope. Based on that brief kind of examination of one aspect of the dream.
Yeah, I'm glad that I could share some of my insights, with you, Cindy and Kathy, and the viewers. I think as we reflect on all of what we've talked about today, I think that a quote is kind of coming to my mind. I it might be from D.W. Winnicott, but I can't say for sure. Um, but it goes something like, "It's a joy to be hidden, but it's a horror to never be found." And I think that that's something
Mm,
that's so critical to what we were talking about, in terms of this relational component. So perhaps some food for thought right there.
that is food for thought. I'm actually, when we post this on the YouTube channel, I'm going to extract that quote and post it because I feel like that we could sink our teeth into that for a while too.
For sure.
Thank
Wow.
you so much, Jordan. This was a wonderful learning opportunity.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much, Jordan. I echo Kathy. This was really amazing. And we're just really appreciative that you shared and shed light, pun intended, onto my dream and just really highlighted some of those really important and sometimes misunderstood pieces about psychoanalysis.
And I
Thank you
hope
for
the
having me.
takeaway as well for people seeking therapy, consider psychoanalysis, consider psychodynamic therapy, and for therapists, consider learning about the theory and seeing if it aligns with what you're thinking. It's such a great opportunity. It's really a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Jordan. And I know we will be in touch soon to talk about psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye.